figure itself out. So yes, welcome to the History of Ideas Reading Club with me, Sammy Woodall. We're used to doing that now with a pause, usually when Jack was in Leiden and we were trying to do the podcast, which we also have that we poorly advertise each session. We always forget. But we have Beyond the Text podcast where you can find, which I think you may have said that you've listened to a little bit of. Mm-hmm. But you can find recordings of the History of Ideas Club of often poor audio quality from the past, but it is getting better, I think. But also Jack and I's further discussions one-on-one about the topics that we cover in these sessions. So if you want to get some juicy hot takes from Jack and I on these topics, then you can listen to those to your heart's content. But today we're going to be looking at Montaigne and de Maistre. As Jack has already said, we're going to sort of push through Montaigne relatively swiftly, and then I'll hand over to Jack to look at de Maistre. But yeah, I'm Sam, I'm doing a PhD with the University of Buckingham, looking at toleration in the English 18th century, so the 18th century and sort of precursory material, 17th, even 16th, is sort of my remit when it comes to looking at political thought. So I'll sort of give a little overview of Montaigne. If there's any questions or anything you want to raise, otherwise we'll push swiftly on. Right, so Montaigne was the progenitor of the essay. The collection we have largely concerns traditional matters, which is why we fitted it into this series on heritage, such as fortune, prayer, custom, repentance, suffering, the purpose of philosophy, and truth, with some seeming trivial in comparison, such as his essays on cannibalism, sleep, drunkenness, and not to counterfeit being sick. Montaigne's aim in all of this is to better understand the human subject, which he said was his philosophy. Thus, his reflections primarily concern human behaviour, trying to expose its often subtle complexity, be it through the lens of Montaigne's own experiences, his observations of others, or his reflections upon history, ancient and contemporary, about which he was well read. Herodotus, Thucydides, Plutarch, Tacitus, Cicero, and many more Greek and Latin authors are cited frequently throughout his canon. Due to the political turbulence of the Reformation age, Montaigne was under constant scrutiny from church authorities, a fact to which he often alludes in his works, though always apparently in sound conscience and good humour. His longest and most celebrated essay, The Apology for Raymond Sebon, defends the Christian scepticism of his condemned friend. Here and throughout the essays, we see Montaigne's weariness of certainty in human and religious matters. This is perhaps best conveyed through his reflections on the uncertainty of human affairs and the need to learn how to die well. For Montaigne, this means overcoming the fear of death through wisdom and the practice of virtue. Virtue, he explains in his essay on the study of philosophy, leads to a contempt of death, because it leads to a basic detachment from all our aims, hopes, and achievements. These are certain aspects that those who have either come to Plato or Augustine we've sort of seen, and this is why we're sort of saying that Montaigne during this period is somewhat a relitigation of those ideas that we've already seen, obviously being rediscovered in the Reformation. Montaigne is also noted for his essay of the education of children, addressed to a friend of his who had asked him to advise how her infant son should be educated when the time came. He presents what might be described today as a Socratic or interrogative question-led approach to education, encouraging teachers to refrain from lecturing at their students and instead to allow them to explore their interests more freely. So if you so desire, please do whatever you want. And yeah, not entirely independently of a teacher's input. The teacher should guide the student's exploration of material by encouraging them to question its very foundations. Here, Montaigne also encourages teachers to caution their students against the vanity of excess in rhetoric or in knowledge. For this session, we have selected the essay of custom. Here, somewhat surprisingly, Montaigne decries what he refers to as the tyranny of custom, complaining that it is more often cited to justify vice and virtue than it is an expression of prejudice rather than love or cultural or piety. Montaigne also argues that what most people call conscience is not natural, but rather a product of custom. However, he also concedes that it is often more dangerous to change a law received than to bear its indolence. So, Jack, I don't know necessarily what do you want to do. Sort of
I would
skip through. Yeah.
That's fine. That's a good summary as well.
Yeah, of Montaigne.
Um,
And yeah, we had also looked at potentially doing Montesquieu, but these might be things that we come back to at a later session. But some questions to think of before we dive into de Maistre is what Montaigne opens up is questioning what can a custom aid to do. Now, as we've sort of just mentioned, he looks at it in a relatively critical vein. Can we think of any positive reasons why some of the customs Montaigne points to have originated and taken hold? What might be the limitations of these? What should we make of Montaigne's celebration of the utility and justice of the Christian religion? Again, something important when we come to de Maistre. And Maistre will take interest in the custom of prayer, paraphrasing him, why have nations always prayed? For de Maistre, the answer has to do with searching for the purpose in suffering, i.e. sanctifying it. Allowing ourselves to be instructed by it in the virtues of humility, patience, and gratitude. Does this introduce a dimension to custom which Montaigne has neglected? Now, this is something we can explore moving forward. We're not going to leave that, are we? Unless you want to, Jack. This was when we attempted to run the session the last time, but
I couldn't be here the last time, so I recorded an introduction. Which we don't know, make them actually here in person.
But that's a nice little ancient world into early modern, so we will now get into the 18th century.
Yeah. Oh, okay. This is the Petersburg dialogue. That will be. Yeah, I'll tell you a little bit about de Maistre's life. Very, what I would say, very much counterpoint to Montaigne, principally because he has he's able to reflect on the fruits of the Reformation, the Renaissance, and the early Enlightenment, and sort of consider whether the skepticism and then also the rationalism of people like Montaigne, which Sam's alluded to, where does that leave us with some of the deepest questions? It was mentioned in that introduction that Montaigne made the human subject his philosophy, and one of the roots for that is the question of what do we do about death? What do we do about death in light of conscience and so forth? And you see, Montaigne deals with these questions on the one hand by saying that conscience is something, what we would say today, socially constructed. So he's wary of what he inherits on that question. But then on the other hand, he still believes death is something that can be reasoned about. And even that sort of going forward to death is something to be practiced in a philosophical way. These are questions I think de Maistre opens up anew. Is conscience really something that we construct? Is death something rational? Is our history rational in the way that Montaigne might like to suggest? Okay. So de Maistre, he is born in 1753. I don't have a biography on here, so I'll just talk a bit about it. He died in 1821, so he lived all the way through the French Revolution, sorry, which was like an anti-Reformation maybe. As you mentioned, he was born in Chambéry in Savoy, which is, I think, at the time it was French territory, I think. It's sort of now modern day northern Italy, I think.
No, Chambéry is now France.
Oh, it's still France. Okay,
Yeah, I've
wonderful.
just been there.
Right, great.
A few weeks ago.
Brilliant.
So it's only about not quite 2 hours from Geneva.
I see. Okay, yeah. So it's still within France. He's born into a Catholic family. His father had been a lifelong servant to the Piedmontese monarchy, which is the Kingdom of Sardinia, which includes Turin, I think the island of Sardinia also. De Maistre was going to spend a lot of his life in these parts, first studying law, following in his father's footsteps, much later as the ambassador to the court of Tsar Alexander II in Russia, on behalf of the island of Sardinia. Maistre was very successful in the Senate, and he was appointed, he was very successful in his legal career, so much so that he was appointed to the Senate, but only months before the revolution actually broke out. And being sort of member of the aristocracy, that was quite dangerous for him. Now, he wrote a lot during this period to try and create dissent against the people who were bringing the revolution about. So he writes Considérations sur la France, basically a long essay exploring the political and theological arguments against the revolution, and in that publication launches his intellectual career really as a Catholic apologist, which is what he's known for in his later works, especially the St. Petersburg dialogues, where he says he's trying to, very much like St. Augustine, justify the ways of God to man. Now, Maistre is a curious figure because he actually, as was unfortunately customary of the time, spent a lot of time in the Masonic lodges studying Illuminism, which is not to be confused with the Illuminati, and it's not that element of the Masonic history. It's rather just the interest in the doctrines and philosophies of Gnosticism, Neoplatonism, and the Eastern religions, and trying to somehow bring them all together in basically a reaction against Enlightenment rationalism. You're going to see Maistre basically playing with some of those themes in a revised way, sort of after he begins to sort of take the Catholicism a bit more seriously and intellectually. So he's always dancing a little bit with that, but I think that begins to change post-revolution. The St. Petersburg Dialogues is a collection of 11 fictitious dialogues he writes in the very classic literary style, where rather than writing a clear argument, you have these characters who are talking back and forth. There's three characters: the Senate, and so the senator, the count, and the chevalier. They discuss themes ranging from justice, virtue, vice, providence, the various philosophical doctrines like the state of nature, and they basically try to combat a lot of the culture of the time in these dialogues, and some speculations in these texts are quite esoteric. For example, the symbolic role of the executioner of the topic he becomes quite fascinated with early on, versus much later dealing with the subject of war. And that's the essay I want to focus on in particular today, because if we're going to explore providence in the early modern to late modern period, a lot of the principal objections to this concept that emerge, and which Maistre spends a lot of time defending, is how providence sits with the moral sense. Is providence something that is just? Is it the case that the good and the bad sort of seem to suffer equally, and if so, what does that imply for providence? And then when you encounter a phenomenon such as war, what you might like to do is assimilate that into your understanding of providence. Is it something that is a function of divine providence, or is it something that you can't square with it? And so this is what he tries to do in the seventh dialogue. Let me. Okay. So, introductions aside, what we'll try to do for the rest of the session is have more of a conversation about these themes. I have quotations that we can read together to focus the discussion. I think I want to begin by opening a discussion with the question, what do we understand by providence? and what is its relation to virtue?
I think it has to do with God at first.
Mhm.
I think that's something we can posit. Something out of our control as humans. Sort of happens to us. And sort of going against this is sort of already something which feels irrational. That's the way of life. But it's sort of the question, like, how does providence unravel through time? Is it only because of God, or do we have do we participate in it in a way? That's a question I have a lot with providence. And one of them is, of course, we are doing everything, but in how far do we have the free will ourselves, or are we sort of more like stimulated by something either natural or divine, or ingrained by society, or so there's a lot of these questions already around the topic. That's my first thoughts.
So I don't really know what the word means to us. I feel it is something like fate. And then you ask the question: is it ordained, and is it something I can know, or do I just discover it along the way? And if I say discovering along the way, am I really discovering anything, or am I just, calling, the things that chance upon me my fate? But I'm not a Christian, so I don't have a strong sense of providence and what it means.
It's the early debates were much more about this metaphysical question of the relationship between providence and freedom, and we saw very briefly. We didn't have a chance to go fully into the argument that Augustine presented, but this is the way Augustine approaches this problem. He's more interested in whether the free will of God and man are compatible hypothetically, and Augustine tries to distinguish blind fate from the personal providence of God, and this is how the Christians have tried to articulate the difference. It's quite a curious factor of de Maistre's writing that he is not at all interested in this argument. He's much more interested in the moral reality of providence and the moral arguments in favour of providence. He sees this as going much deeper than the metaphysical question. So, in other words, he thinks that the moral approach to this question sort of almost incorporates the assumption that the freedom, the compatible. So, to put it another way, how do we make sense of the fact that we have a moral sense? That would be the approach to this question, to try and derive providence from the fact of the moral sense. What would make the moral sense cohere with reality and with our broader experience?
Can I just observe? So is this a move towards a more empirical understanding? So metaphysical providence, Augustine always felt that it was metaphysical.
Yes.
And it was of its time in a sense. It was knowledge passed down from God, from the Bible. It was that
I wouldn't even say it's only metaphysical, like theological. In a way, like it works in revelation in a way.
But not empirical.
Yes, indeed.
Which is a very significant step from metaphysics in a way.
Yes. So exactly. So for that reason, I think Maistre is doing something a bit more radical, and we'll see if he's successful. Let's begin. Never lose sight of this general truth, that a general law, if it is not unjust for all, cannot be so for the individual. Do not have a particular illness, but you could have it. You have it, but you could have been exempt. one who perished in a battle could have escaped. The one who escaped could have perished. All are not dead, but all went there to die. So no more injustice. The just law is not that which affects everyone, but that which is made for everyone. They really do not know what they are saying when they complain that vice is happy and virtue unhappy in this world. If the good man does not suffer because he is good, and if the wicked man does not prosper because he is wicked, the objection disappears.
I don't get that last sentence.
They really do not know what they are saying when they complain that vice is happy and virtue unhappy in this world. So vice is happy means vice goes rewarded.
Yeah.
Virtue unhappy means virtue goes unrewarded.
So when you do vice, you rob and you
Yes.
gain. And being virtuous is like sort of suffering in a way.
Yeah. And he said, if the good man does not suffer because he is good, and if the wicked man does not prosper because he is wicked, the objection disappears. So what is this objection that Maistre references? What are we trying to show us in this passage?
I think he's just giving his like opinion that he thinks that suffering is inherently belongs to the good man, and he does good. The wicked man. Okay, so he says like if that doesn't happen, the objection disappears. But I don't see what he means with sort of the objection.
Is it saying if a good man suffers, if a good man may suffer, but not because he is good? And the suffering and the good are separate.
Yes. Exactly.
And if the bad man.
This goes into like the Roman thing that they thought sort of our actions and our suffering are sort of tied together, right?
Can you tell us a bit more?
Well, you mentioned this thing about the Romans sort of having this idea of that your material way of behaving, your actions, that they, and then also the sort of rewards you have in life, the things you experience or get done to you, that they say something sort of parallel to your sort of supernatural state, how the gods look at you, which is more sort of one-on-one than maybe Christianity would say, because we can see in Christianity that sort of you suffer because, well, Christ suffered, but he was fully good. So it wasn't sort of, any bounty, any benefits of like, well, resurrection from the dead, which is quite a bounty, but
Why does it to get this issue quite clear, why does it appear problematic that the good suffer or that the evil go unpunished? How does this potentially undermine providence?
Well, it kind of says that if providence is one-on-one with the world, and God really behind providence, then he would never let a good man suffer, because God is sort of ever just, right?
Yes.
He would never let a good man suffer.
The self-centered teleology. One acts well to get well.
Is that a quote?
No. But I was just going to say. But then the existential critique. Then you were saying, what is providence?
Okay.
It's arbitrariness.
We don't know. It brings us to the question like, is death somewhat in God? Like, does God want some things that have to do with death? And I think suffering always has to do with sort of death or evil in a way. Because
so if you look at Augustine, for example, I think he was saying, you may suffer in this life.
You will.
Yes, you will. Yeah, don't fight it.
Yeah.
But your reward or your place in heaven will come in the next life. So there's actually there's a balance sheet going on here. So is the balance sheet solely within this life? Yeah, or is part of it in the in heaven, following death? And if so, how do you, to what extent do you feel it is just that you should be a good person but suffer in this life, but get your reward in the next life? Allegedly, or not. So we had part of the problem is we just don't know what we should count towards a just life.
And I was saying to you, Jake, just then, semantically, providence is something shunned by, say, the 1940s existentialists because it's, intertwined with arbitrariness. It's intertwined with this kind of idea that, decisions are made. So semantically, yes, providence can be this kind of divine intervention, but on the flip side, it's also, that was providential, sort of like, it becomes that kind of, as you're saying, sort of fate or kind of, which obviously...
You can call it what you want, and every answer is true. It was luck, it was providence, it was my genius, take a pick.
But I think what's interesting about arbitrariness is that arbitrariness is coming into exactly what de Maistre is trying to put across here, and then coming out of just seeming arbitrary. And I think maybe, I don't know, Jack, if that kind of leads you in the direction of where we're going. But sort of when you're raised with arbitrariness and why are certain things going a certain way for the good or for the vice-filled individual.
What I think is also good with reading Maistre is that we need to really go into his mind, and he's a Catholic, so we need to have sort of articles of faith pretty well explained, on which he builds for his case of providence, because you just told us that you were not a Christian, for example, and so that sort of can understand really what providence is from the Christian perspective. So it will be important to see sort of, for example, because he's going to say God does not have any evil in him, and sort of another thing is that we fell, of course, the original sin, which sort of brings into the need for justice and the case of sort of suffering because we sinned, therefore we suffer in a way.
One thing that comes to mind is, if you look at it from a general perspective, it's hard to see generally how there can be meaning in suffering or how providence is at work. But if I look at it just for me in my life, I can see I suffer, I can see the fruit of that, and I can see that's hopefully helping my spiritual life. I have a conviction that actually the rewards are here and now in terms of maybe not physically, but in terms of some sense of peace. But then I can't say how someone else is going to benefit from suffering, but they can discover that for themselves. My hope is.
Yeah.
But it feels to me like it also is unpacking traditional Christianity, because once you're no longer saying, Catholic Church, the Bible, here is the answer. You're saying, well, have a think about it. Even if you're still a Christian, never mind people like me, but even if you're still a Christian, your Christianity is no longer the same once you start to question and try to interpret what providence is. It's not a given anymore.
It's something we really struggle with in theology, to work out what providence really means, especially the question of evil. I think we only take the articles of faith and try to reason with them. It's because we have had some discussion on it as well.
We have. I hope we'll get on to some of those themes a bit later. Let us read on. Suppose each moral action were paid, so to speak, by some temporal advantage. The act, having nothing more of the supernatural, would no longer merit a recompense of this kind. Suppose, on the other hand, that in virtue of some divine law the thief's hand should fall off the moment he committed the theft. People would refrain from theft as they refrain from putting their hand under the butcher's cleaver. The moral order would disappear entirely. Therefore, to reconcile this order with the laws of justice, it is necessary that virtue be recompensed and vice punished, even in this world, but not always, not immediately. It is necessary that the incomparably greater portion of temporal happiness be attributed to virtue, and a proportional amount of unhappiness be to vice, but that the individual never be sure of anything. Imagine the other hypothesis, It will lead you directly to the destruction of the moral order or to the creation of another world. What has Maistre added here?
Virtue, right?
Is this to do with freedom? So, in order to do something that has merit, I need to be free to do something that's evil. Otherwise, there'd be no merit either if there's such a huge reward in my virtue that it's just sort of too easy to do, or if my hand would drop off if I was going to do something bad.
Could I
limit my freedom? I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, you've got to remember the backdrop of this, which is it's when is this penned?
Sorry,
the year.
Oh, I didn't tell you actually. Forgive me. I didn't tell you when it was penned, and that's partly because I don't have it on there. However, if I quickly inspect 1821, it was published, but that means it was published posthumously because it's an unfinished book. So he was basically writing it sort of from 1803 to 1817. That's when he was posted in St. Petersburg. Sorry.
But no, I mean, this is in the vein of a massive counter-Enlightenment movement that specifically opposes what they referred to as the mechanization of Enlightenment, the mechanism of the scientific element, but also the scientific into the political. So you've got someone like Bentham, who's actually being brought across from England to address the French Convention. And I mean, this to me, particularly what you were just referencing in terms of, how should we do justice? Should we cut off the hand of a thief for a crime that's committed with the hand? This sort of thing. It's very much it really feels like it's countering the culmination of Enlightenment political philosophy in something like the utilitarian movement, which would be exactly that sort of, end of a utilitarian line of thought at this time, which would be, well, if they do X, then we respond with X, and this is how we create a fairer, equal sort of moral system within these kind of emerging, whether it be republics in France or, and Bentham's addressing the French Convention at the sort of, I think, end of the 18th century. I can't remember when, but he's invited to present. And I mean, this is exactly the kind of thing that de Maistre would be looking at and thinking, this is the wrong direction for French society to be moving in. The mechanism of Enlightenment, the kind of, everyone's a part of it and will find a way to kind of equal out like a piece of a machine. You do this wrong, well, this happens to you. And then you do this right, well, you get this, sort of what we would now see as kind of maybe socialist or Soviet communist kind of ideas of kind of like reward and punishment. I know. I'm using that flippantly, but but sort of moving in that direction. But I don't want to be anachronistic and read it back. But that would be the critique, sort of like,
I think it was like Aristotle, practical reasoning, virtue, all wrapped up in a very elegant sentence. Actually, when you think of it, with utilitarianism, I'm talking about happy as opposed to eudaimonia. And you're kind of there.
So would you call this the kind of romantic era response?
I'd certainly say so. It's in the vein of, well, Rousseau's a difficult character, but he obviously is put into the counter-Enlightenment canon.
And in which case, like any reaction, do they end up going too far and falling into a similar trap in that if that approach leads to licentiousness or that sort of spontaneity at all costs, then you end up actually depriving yourself of freedom in a different way because it leads to addiction or it leads to a society where the strongest can dominate because there's no structure.
Certainly, but I think Jack would be best placed to kind of respond to that kind of in terms of in the case of de Maistre. But I mean, what we also have to remember is in a romantic vein, I would completely agree. Yes, and that is what the counter-Enlightenment leads to through people like Goethe, Sturm and Drang, much sort of in this period, late 18th century, kind of turning into that very much kind of romanticized view of spontaneity, individualism, and on that side, But we've got to remember that these terms are horrible, hyphenated, anachronistically written terms that we're putting on these thinkers. I mean, Rousseau is as much an Enlightenment figure as he is a counter-Enlightenment figure. Goethe could be romantic, he could be part of the Enlightenment, he's using the same tools, ideas, but just going to a different end. But Jack, in terms of the substance, you might want to respond.
Yeah, I'd like to correct your initial interpretation, Joe. It's not so much freedom that's in question here, but intention.
Okay.
Suppose each moral action were paid by some temporal advantage. The act, having nothing more of the supernatural, would no longer merit any recompense. Why do we act virtuously? This is the question that's being raised. Is providence just to be understood as reward, or is it something else? This is what the second paragraph seems to me to bring into question. So in this sense, it's not fortune. Providence isn't fortune in a calculated sense, or it's not utilitarian. It's a relevant connection, I understand. Is it fate? It's not possible to conclude necessarily from this paragraph, because we're still dealing with where do actions lead potentially in their longevity. So if I do steal, maybe my hand doesn't fall off immediately, maybe I do feel good. But in the end, some kind of justice on average does accrue to thieves because of the constitution of societies, perhaps, but also because of the constitution of our conscience. We think we get away with things in the moment, but then we are tormented. And this is one way, I think, I'm reading a little bit beyond what this text says here, but one way that I think that we can now move from the first to the second paragraph, saying, first of all, that suffering isn't obviously connected to whether you're virtuous or viceful. It isn't connected in a one-on-one way, but it's not completely disinterested either. It's not arbitrary, which was what the first paragraph begins to suggest. It's neither. It's not. And maybe that is the sense in which it maybe not fate. I don't know if you think that's sufficient.
So the idea that you accrue something.
Indeed.
One way or the other.
Yes, but it's not immediate, and it's because the intention has to be pure. Providence is about the cultivation of intention. Is that a fair interpretation? Any objection?
Want to go again, the last sentence?
Providence, it seems to me that the Maistre is suggesting here that providence has a lot more to do with the formation of intention.
Yeah, so the formation or the exercise,
That's a good question.
What I
Perhaps both. Perhaps both. Because I think that's reciprocal.
But one can be you can be self-aware and form intents with the intent, the further intent of becoming virtuous. Does that work?
That's a good question.
And if it results in you becoming virtuous,
yes,
is that a bad method? You're debating the method there.
I think so de Maistre deals with it. He says, suppose each moral action were paid by a temporal advantage. Now, the question is, do we value what we do in the context of what we understand as virtue because of what it gives us, or do we value virtue in itself? So I think what you're describing there, Bruce, would be something like valuing virtue in itself, which is a good thing to value. I do want to be virtuous. But you'll get there by any means, or? Well, if you really want to be virtuous, then that means to get there to the best of your ability by virtuous means.
But in the Enlightenment, it doesn't necessarily mean so, because you've also got that wave of the kind of Bernard Mandevilles of private vice, public good, the kind of, again, this is obviously the context within which this is being written, but the idea that actually a public virtue might be something that you can work towards by facilitating your own interests, lining your own pocket, or, so this again is something that's happening with the mechanization of Europe, industrially, politically, the idea that economies can start to function in a much more intricate way, where private individuals might be able to do something which lines their own pockets or is in their own interest, but actually might create something potentially, much bigger than would have been created if you'd given all your money to the state or to the church or to, if you do it for your own interest. So
you can ask yourself, is ambition a virtue? If your answer is no, then it's a non-virtuous means of achieving perhaps a virtuous outcome.
Yeah.
If your answer is yes, then you're being virtuous by coveting an office in which you'll then exercise other virtues, such as charity.
I didn't perceive the objection that you raised.
That there would be an aim of virtue.
Yes.
An aim of doing something good. Or perhaps even a kind of counterweight to your vice, going further back to the Medicis putting up statues as a response to their vice.
But you already understand what they're doing there.
True.
You've already answered the question, I think.
But the telos is still virtue. The aim is still virtue.
No, it's not. It's not.
I think someone like Mandeville would argue that it is.
I think Mandeville's wrong. I don't know who he is. Let me explain why. It seems to me that Medici already has decided in his heart, and he's made it very
that it's
obvious
wrong.
to
Yeah,
us
no,
readers
admittedly.
that I want to compensate for my vice. He doesn't love virtue. He wants to compensate for his vice. That's different.
Yeah.
And I think this is, and again, you mentioned sort of, I think, and now I understand this distinction. You mean public virtue, private
vice, or
private vice.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. This is the same. This is not the love of virtue because it's not sincere.
Yeah.
It turns what's understood as virtue into a means to satisfy your guilt in your own terms. And that means it just amounts to pride.
Yeah.
Or at the very least, the covering over of shame that needs to be felt for sort of repentance and growth.
Yeah.
But your love of virtue leading to action, those actions must be channeled through specific virtues. You can't pursue virtue in the abstract.
Yes.
You have to pursue charity or whichever.
That's right.
And then it comes to the question of which virtues are virtues. It's all fashion. But which then leads on to the question of where does the authority class point come from?
It's a very good question. I proceed now to the subject of war, because that is an interminable question beyond the scope of this time. But very happy to discuss afterwards. I also mentioned, because we are coming up against 8 o'clock, but we started a bit late. If people are willing, we can keep going for as long as people are willing. But if I knew you have to go, that's perfectly fine. So the gold quotation came from the very first dialogue, where Maistre settles very quickly some common objections to providence. What relation had it to virtue and vice? Why is it that the good seem to suffer and the evil people seem to get away with everything? And he tries to dispel some of these common objections. But now a much bigger task opens up for him, if we follow him so far. What about something like war? What is the relationship between war and providence? Is war something that's somehow understood to have its good in a more philosophical or theological sense, in that it has a function in this world? So it's not something irrational, but it's something that can be made sense of. And is it something, first of all, that can be made sense of in human terms, or is it something that requires the language of theology to understand? This is the question he sets for himself. He begins, explain why the most honourable thing in the world, according to the judgment of all humanity, without exception, has always been the right to shed innocent blood innocently. If you look at the matter closely, you will see that there is something mysterious and inexplicable in the extraordinary value that men have always attached to military glory, the more so in that if we took it into account only theory and human reasoning, we would be led to directly opposite ideas. So it's not a question of explaining the possibility of war by the glory that surrounds it, but of explaining this glory itself, which is not easy. If I could supplement this paragraph with a comment he makes at this point, but which I haven't put on there, maybe to bring this question into the concrete. he asked us to consider the difference between the soldier and the executioner. He said, imagine someone with no knowledge of human customs comes up to you. Today we would say, imagine an alien comes to Earth. Imagine an alien comes to Earth, and he asked about soldiers and he asked about executioners, and you tell him, oh well, a soldier goes to war and he kills people, in the context of war. The executioner kills people who have done who have committed crimes they've stolen or whatever. And the alien might say, oh, but it seems to me that the executioner is a very noble figure, and that the soldier is somebody a bit more barbarous. But Maistre says, at least in the context of his day, the politics of this question have shifted dramatically, it must be said, so let us discount that problem. In the 19th century, people basically felt that executioners were very much taboo, but soldiers were very noble figures, as long as they were acting according to the conventions of military etiquette, which there was a fairly well formulated military etiquette, which Maistre goes on to describe in a later paragraph, which I will show. What is it that leads to that instinct? Why do we differentiate the soldier and the executioner morally?
I was wondering this in terms of it being in the moment a fair fight or not. So yes, someone might be a criminal, they committed a crime a month ago, they're being executed here and now. But in the here and now, they're tied up. And the executioner's got an axe or whatever, he's a big strong man, he's just killing them. Whereas, at least in soldiers, generally speaking, you've got one army versus another, they're shooting at each other, they're all sort of perhaps equally armed. As a fair fight. So in the moment, it seems far more noble than just this seemingly poor, innocent criminal.
Especially when you take it in relation to the whole society sort of built upon Christian values as well.
Yeah.
Right? So you will be pretty much looked down upon if you just kill such a man who seems helpless.
Yeah. But the criminal could have murdered 20 people painfully, tortuously, and everyone would agree he deserved it. And there could have been 10 soldiers against one soldier. So in a sense, there may be a preconception as to the scenario and the balance, but there wouldn't be an absolute truth about it.
Yeah.
I'm just pacifist in general.
But I think both of these are about the protection of society is the in-group, either protecting from the out-group or protecting from the betrayal of somebody within that group. So I feel there's a common moral base there, and the differences are almost social.
Yeah.
There's also a question of value judgment of systems at this time as well, I guess, in the sense that when one condemns, and this is something debated in France at the time, in terms of when one condemns one to death in one's own state, you are essentially admitting that your state has failed that citoyen, or in its time. If you're fighting against another state, you're fighting against a value system, you're fighting against, a whole set of beliefs that perhaps you as an Enlightenment figure believe are wrong.
Or they've attacked you.
Or they've attacked you and are threatening yours. I mean, it's funny you mentioned aliens, Jack, because Voltaire actually does mention the idea of how would we deal with not only countries afar, but say there were other cultures on other planets. He actually does mention this, and most people like to kind of skip over it because they're like, the philosophy here is probably complicated enough on Earth's terra firma, let alone venturing into other ones. But how do you start to come up against other value systems, other
So like you say, it's hard to have an absolute answer to it. It very much depends on the context, especially if once you've got a criminal tied up, you can castrate them. For example,
you have options.
Yeah, there's options. Whereas if an army is literally invading your country, you've got to attack them to defend themselves. But then if you're invading their country, then it's
more arises.
Can people didn't fight for their own country? The Swiss fought for the French. The English fought. One's on that side, one's on this side.
Also, war comes from a breakdown of war by other means, politics and leaders And you could say it's unjust that the soldiers kill the soldiers. What they should all do is kill the leaders, and then elect new leaders and get them to focus.
Yeah, if you get better leaders, you just make peace.
Right.
Yeah.
You would hope.
I quite like that idea.
Why are we letting our soldiers sort of fight? Put the leaders in the ring and we will figure it out. It's sort of the actual people.
So the soldiers enjoy
Instead
it.
of the rich.
I mean, if they've been forcefully conscripted, that's one thing. If they volunteer because they want to risk death, for whatever reason,
Courage is a virtue, then they're going to want to do it.
and they feel courageous.
Yeah.
Is that
Isn't it
sense
more-
of duty, don't they?
Yeah.
Well, you have the old English tale about Beowulf. He just goes and slays dragons.
Doesn't it also have to do with the executioner really being shunned in the Middle Ages, and that probably comes from the idea that execution is revenge, and as Christians we're meant to forgive and not revenge.
There's this tense between sort of Christian and secular, because it's also what happens in sort of the Old Testament and the New Testament.
Yeah.
The Old Testament is eye for an eye, but
Exactly.
Christ sort of fulfills the law of the Old Testament, and so we are born anew, and we are not pertained to the law anymore, but we are now under the law of mercy. So we don't belong to this earth basically anymore, in a way that we don't pursue the justice of the law. In a way, we forgive. That's how I interpret it.
And then that sort of comes into tension when you're running a society and having to protect people. And if there's people being violent against the vulnerable, how do you protect them?
Yeah, well, it's Christ who gave sort of an example of lowering himself to a servant to be basically defenseless. But he's also a king. So if we become kings and we try to imitate Christ, we throw away our weapons and we got to become a servant as well to another country as well.
For ourselves, of course. But it's more that if someone was attacking my, children or something.
Yeah.
How do I defend them? So I can be meek and I can, be the servant and so on. That's what I call them. But how do I defend someone else vulnerable without using force against the aggressor? I guess it's a big question.
Well, I think Christ shows that love is sort of the biggest strength in the world, as sort of humanized in the Holy Spirit.
Exactly.
Which acts solely through love and can sort of defeat evil. For example, with the apostles afterwards.
But in practice, your children die, and you're a good man.
Is it loving to protect my children against someone who's charging out?
That's really one of the biggest objections sort of this sort of pacifist Christian sense of really like pouring yourself out just in servitude to your neighbor, whoever this neighbor is, right?
Or is that a way?
Neighbor.
Is that a way of serving as a Christian would be to attack the axe murderer who's threatening my children? And that would be the most loving thing to do in that instance. Not that I'm going to just generally be bloodthirsty. I think it's possible to be a Christian and also someone who defends the vulnerable.
Well, this is the question, right? Because it's in a way sort of doing the judgment again and the return of it. Right? You kill, so I kill back.
Not necessarily, but if it's in the moment, if it's simultaneous with the aggressor attacking the vulnerable, I defend.
What if there is a Holy Spirit?
But of course, so you would hope in any given moment there's a way of resolving something without killing him. So there might be a way of preventing him through, but without. But then once someone's committed an evil action, if I then go a few days later and just go and kill him, I think that's very different to in the moment using proportionate force to defend the child.
And also, like, God is omnipotent, right? Almighty. And we are all like children of God, but He doesn't save us like every second, right, from evil.
Right. Yeah.
And He sent His own Son to be basically tortured while He's fully without sin, which other people aren't even.
But if He doesn't save us, are you saying that we can then save ourselves? Well, actually, your case of children is a great example. So if you want to protect your children and you choose to kill them, and God is not going to, you're not expecting God to make a difference at this point in any providential.
He might do in extraordinary circumstances, but you can't assume he will.
Yeah. So you can't assume he will. So you exercise your individual practical reasoning.
Exactly, that's what
quite possibly going against doctrine. Or
sure,
scripture, and you take action. Now that could be in the moment, and you could say, well, it was instinct, I reacted to it, I didn't reason about it.
Yeah.
But it could be a week later when you say, well, actually, I fended them off this time, but next time I won't be lucky. So if I don't do something,
I better time up.
I better time up and or stab him in the back or whatever it's going to be. So I don't think is one of those morally right and the other is morally wrong. I'm not sure there.
Okay, so you could also say, like, if you in that moment sort of act like that, and then a week later you think about it and you're like, oh, but actually I was in a state of despair. I was in a state broken from God. I had fear in myself, but actually Christ freed us from the fear of death, freed us from seeing, from this fear, and to have trust in the Holy Spirit. And then you can repent, for example, but still you did it. But in this repentance, you're still saved in a way.
Are you saying it's okay if he takes that action? Are you if in that fear, in that moment, are you saying it's okay if he takes that action?
No, so I would say it's not okay in itself. Sort of, if you're under the law of Christ, but you just mentioned, if you just from practical reasoning, when someone attacks you, you sort of start defending because you don't believe, for example, you cannot assume that God is going to help you in this way. But I think once you're in the law of God, because Christ showed us that he revealed himself and gave us his Holy Spirit and showed us that he actually does intervene. And I think once you have sort of that sort of switch, that you're sort of under a new covenant instead of the Old Testament covenant.
In extraordinary circumstances, God performs miracles, but day to day, God allows us to use our reason and our, he gives us that dignity of exercising our freedom. So the normal way of things, he doesn't just intervene in everything, because he even allows an evil person the freedom to attack a child. He doesn't just intervene every time. You see that people are dying all over the world. Christians are being killed, in various countries, are being attacked.
We also need to acknowledge that already in 400, when Christianity became the religion of the Roman Empire, we said it is just to wage war. So we already sort of went away from sort of this purity of the faith. So if that goes such a long way, and the whole generation is built upon that, of course, it's not God intervening because we don't believe in it.
I believe, and many children who have been killed around the world have a strong Christian faith, and they're still being killed because God does allow evil people the freedom to do things. That's why we need, I suppose, ways of defending ourselves.
But there's also a state of nature.
But they will maybe go to heaven as well, right?
And of course,
eventually it's important for them to go to heaven.
That's the ultimate good.
And participate in the eternal life,
the
resurrection of
the ultimate hope. But this is a fallen world as well. Before we get to heaven,
what if you defend your children and these children sort of grow up with your sort of mindset of always defending yourself?
But this is the thing. This is value judgments, and there's a state of nature of value judgments, which I think is what de Maistre is pointing towards, and where perhaps a virtuous cause arises. Jack, I don't know if you want to give us some revelation, maybe some divine providence intervening in this debate to be able to reveal to us the truth before we look towards the next text in our canon.
I don't want to end just yet. If people are happy to stay, very smoothly, I don't want to end just there. I commend you. I would like to slowly, not in a rush, but slowly just walk through the rest of Maistre's argument, because this is obviously a point of contention, and one that becomes increasingly apparent as we follow his argument. Is Maistre's analysis and application of providence to the subject of war fully Catholic, This is a question, a doctrinal question.
Mm.
It's a
He's
very
also
open
trying
question.
to sort of protect capitalism
Yes.
as well.
What is I think relevant for the discussion for now is that in terms of just war theory, he's entirely in his time, and this is what you present, Matthew. I think it's a very modern perspective. I don't mean to say invalid. Matthew and I have been having a conversation about this, I find aspects of it very persuasive, but I also share Joe's objections, and we're going on about this. Now, what is a couple of things came to mind, sort of from a bit earlier on in the discussion. The soldier, we would to go back a bit. The soldier was war as such was a consequence of failed states. You mentioned, Bruce.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's this question of how that manifests itself ethically, which we began to explore in particulars. Maistre raises this question as a sort of an extension of the original question. So we began by asking, and we haven't, I don't think any of us particularly understand how de Maistre thinks of this, how it is glory is attributed to the soldier, because we seem to be saying that the soldier is someone employed in very broken circumstances. So we haven't really gotten to understand why Maistre and many people elevate that position.
He doesn't always know the opponent. Like really, like why it's an opponent.
Indeed.
He doesn't always know it. You know, it's a lot of smart people about it who really know the history of their country and the sort of.
But that's
Isn't
sorry, please go on.
Isn't a lot of this value, whether killing is glorious or bad, just convention? And then
Custom.
what is the difference between customs and convention?
Can you elaborate a bit more?
Well, I was trying to get to the point of the essays on customs. by
Right,
Maistre.
okay, yes.
And I mean,
Okay.
so much of the values we put on things, most people don't actually think about them. It's just convention. The last 2 or 3 decades have been particularly bad, where value judgments were just conventions.
Okay. Yep, I see.
Agree with that, but I think if you say convention or if you say custom, I think it is custom. Today's
What's the
convention.
difference between
Well,
convention and custom?
I think convention is what we have today, and custom is the history that came to today.
Well, if you look at just law nowadays, England, for example, works on customary law, right? Or not? There's sort of this precedent on customary law. Yeah, but some sort of more overly sort of rely on statutory law.
Yeah, and the statutes go back many
Yes.
years.
Well, England has a much more a richer history with customary law.
Yeah.
There's these discussions within law, like what's better.
Not basically written down.
Yeah,
In
it's
that
a
sense,
lot
yeah,
about precedents.
Okay.
Not in
So it's like
the
the constitution.
So there's
this
sort of
That's what he means.
And the glory of war is perhaps that kind of thing. Where, because how I see it is actually there was a point in time, maybe 1,000 years ago, when actually the normal state, the normal state was a state of war. Even when there were city-states in Greece, they would be in tension, where quite possibly they would have to go to war. So it seems that actually glorifying war is a way of preparing people for death. Yeah. And those behaviours, those customs have continued up to today, but the circumstances haven't necessarily continued. Which is why
It's
we
sort of
have
interesting if you take it from the sort of just evolution theory in general. With evolution, we basically eat each other up to progress as a whole, right? And so maybe sort of societies ingrained, sort of took over this dialectical approach with that.
There's phases of evolution.
Yeah, and so they sort of prepare each other to die, such that the strongest sort of survive and go on,
Yeah.
which is something I don't agree with. That it's a good thing,
But
but
it's not the strongest, it's the providential ones.
it feels like a secular way of approaching. Like there is sort of, if you believe in God, right? There is already the perfect thing, so we don't have to evolve anymore because God can give it to us only if we submit to it.
Okay, I lost the thread of the argument. I'm sorry, that's my fault. I would like to, Joe, you're going.
Just before we shoot off in a few
Yeah.
minutes.
Okay. I will. There's a lot more to get through. A few
We will go through it.
A few we will go through it.
You will be hearing from it. Yeah. And Jack won't let me go when.
And
we
I'm
go
very
through
happy
it.
to continue the discussions either here or as we maybe migrate to either a pub nearby or the National Liberal Club, depending on preference. But I will just quickly take the opportunity to summarise the rest of the argument, just for people's interest. De Maistre believes that, in my interpretation, that war is supra-rational. So it's not irrational, its rationality, its intelligibility extends beyond human concepts and human logic. More precisely, it's actually a very Catholic logic. It's the logic of sort of sacramental sacrifice. The sort of in the context of original sin, and in the spirit of searching for opportunity in all of the brokenness and suffering in this world, war is the highest expression of a more general law of destruction and violence through which things are sanctified. This is Maistre's interpretation of war. This is how he brings it under providence.
There was this really good sentence of him saying, "We are just as a whole on the altar,
yes,
burning as a sacrifice,
yes,
to be purified."
This is it. This is Maistre's understanding. To get there, he tells us a little bit about some of the be careful how I say it, the goods in the philosophical sense of war. This paragraph is quite interesting. Basically, to summarize, to paraphrase it, war tended to have an etiquette in that time. Things are a bit different now. There's still the Geneva Convention, but obviously there are politics and there are things like this and there are abuses of Geneva Convention. All of this, we understand this, and probably also back then. But an amusing line: they all knew to stop war at Easter and at Christmas.
Finish it by then.
Yeah. Right. And also many you see many advances in medicine and many applications of medicine in these times, and many saints in the Catholic tradition risen in this time in response to the war. So all these like particularly practical ways in which you see virtues emerging from the catastrophe, the political catastrophe, the moral catastrophe, humanly speaking. Also, the moral formation of the soldiers is something Maistre points to, but the paradox is how you have the moral formation of the soldiers and the discipline, and then the bloodlust which develops. And this is why he leans more into this cycle of violence which is sanctified. And then he has this remarkable literary passage, which is very worth reading if you haven't. War is therefore divine in itself, since it is a law of the world. War is divine for its consequences of a supernatural nature. Who could doubt the great privileges to be found in death in battle? Who could believe that the victims of this dreadful sentence have shed their blood in vain? War is divine in the mysterious glory that surrounds it, in the no less inexplicable attraction that draws us to it. It is divine in the protection granted to its great leaders, blah, blah, blah. It is divine in its results. It is this sort of drumbeat of this phrase. It's compositionally a masterful chapter, regardless of how whether we agree with him. The translator says Maistre is not someone to be taken seriously. And
Which falls in line with Plato as well. This is a very kind of an irony with heritage rhetoric, which is that they often criticise the use of rhetoric, and then will go for it.
But we must not lose sight of the observations that are still striking. there's something about war that resists rational comprehension. It's true what Maistre said. The leaders are inexplicably, on the whole, saved from the catastrophe of war. They outlive the war. What constitutes a victory in war is entirely inexplicable. What constitutes the trajectory of the war is something you can't plan. People who study the history of war become very familiar with all these anomalies. I set out to do this and are completely circumvented by the most remarkable circumstances. When is the war won? You can't answer that because the numbers are always different. You have these instances of the minorities overcoming the majority. You point to factors, but it's a great mystery. And what Maistre concludes is that what loses the war is fear, and the antidote to that is prayer and thanksgiving, and it's why they prayed the Te Deum in European culture throughout the wars, to instill fear in the enemy and for them to give thanks. And what I just want to mention about this chapter, if you haven't read it fully, is it presents a great mystery on the literary front, because it's this dialogue about war, and then halfway through he starts talking about David and the Psalms. And the thing I've been wrestling with and trying to understand, what on earth is the connection? But it's so subtle. And then it ends with this meditation on searching out the mysteries of providence in the night. And it's all very beautiful. It's all very beautifully written. And I think it touches on some critical mysteries of human experience and politics. And it challenges the idea that war is senseless, because it's terrible, but it's not senseless. And it challenges the idea that it tries to assimilate it not into something that's human, approaching it, and he leaves the mystery open. It's a remarkable chapter. It's a remarkable book.
Isn't it?
Sorry?
The call to faith.
The call to faith. It is a call to faith. It precisely is. Yes.
And an executioner would not have such a calling.
That's a great question.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming, Joe.
Thank you.
It was also a call against waging war on one's own population, which is what we saw at the end of, I think, a slide or two ago, which was the idea that the true scenes of this devastating plague. Now, what we see with the French Revolution is a plague of conflict waged against the citizens of a country, not by an enemy force, but by one's own government. Something which Maistre was acutely aware. There are other thinkers, Jack, who are acutely aware.
You're so good at this.
Who are acutely aware.
Then, our next seminar in 2 weeks' time is Edmund Burke, Reflections on the Revolution in France. And we decided, because we did a bit of Burke in the last series, I just selected some excerpts and we decided it would be really interesting to read him alongside romantic poetry from Wordsworth and Byron. To see, I don't actually know, I haven't done the scholarship, whether Burke and, whether Wordsworth and Byron read Burke, but it's not the point. The point is the culture and the milieu, the intellectual milieu, the response to revolution and the response to rationalism in both these thinkers.
The cyclone of intellectual thought that was
Edmund Burke
ripping its way through England at the time.
The Romanticism. But Edmund Burke is also, in my opinion, a cyclone of thought.
Yeah.
And so the question is, what is, I want to investigate with you all, what is the connection between Burke and Romanticism and the poetry, and I think it'll be a pleasant evening.
Certainly.
Less intellectually dense as this one, which is a lot of very difficult and controversial terrain,
but just as engaging.
Yeah,
it's
I hope so.
definitely a surprising choice.
Yes, I really recommend it. It's so stimulating, this book, the St. Petersburg Dialogues. It's one of the greatest books I've ever read, and I'm not someone who agrees with Maistre on everything. I think his Catholicism needs an application of Catholicism needs tweaking personally. However, it's in the spirit of what the translator said. Don't take it too seriously, and you come away with I should have mentioned, he's one of the most learned men of his period. His grasp of different languages is immense. His reading of the classics and contemporary literature is among the most well-read people of his time. I have a quotation from one of his contemporaries somewhere here. One witness describes him in St. Petersburg as, without contradiction, the most outstanding personage of the time and place in which we lived, abandoning himself to the limpid course of his eloquence, laughing wholeheartedly, arguing with grace, animating and governing the conversation. He's a real character, and it really comes through in this book, and it's got such a breadth of subject matter, including very seminal critiques of the state of nature, of for instance, that even just something as simple as our general sense that language emerged from primitive societies. Maistre makes the case that it actually is a degenerative thing. It's like so many things. Like wow, like breadth of subject matter and so on. It's very stimulating, and I think it's a underrepresented book in the canon, and we were both enlightened to it by a mutual friend of ours who may be listening.
Yeah,
he's over in Canada, and it was like,
Derek might be, and I'm sure Derek would like to be joining us at the National Liberal Club.
Yes, which is where we will proceed, potentially, unless we go to. But
we will imbibe and further the knowledge. Thank you to everyone online, and we will see you in 2 weeks' time. Thank you very much indeed.
Wonderful, very good, very good.